The jagged starboard bilge keel of a massive armored cruiser broke the calm surface of a busy wartime anchorage, serving as an improvised navigational warning to passing fleet traffic. The warship carried heavy protective plating, 6 inches in parts of the belt and barbettes, but the safer conclusion is that an internal magazine explosion tore through a confined, heavily built cruiser rather than the armor itself being the proven cause of the pressure buildup. The blast destroyed the aft magazine area, so the opening reconstruction must remain cautious rather than claiming preserved chemical proof from the point of origin. On December 30, 1915, the naval anchorage of the Cromarty Firth in Scotland presented a scene of absolute operational routine. The British Royal Navy heavily utilized the deep, sheltered waters of the Firth to stage its massive capital ships between patrols in the North Sea. Anchored right in the middle of this strategic waterway was the armored cruiser His Majesty's ship Natal. She was a 13,550-ton vessel of the Warrior class, presenting an imposing profile characterized by heavy gun turrets and a reinforced steel hull designed to engage enemy combatants at close range. Her magazines were stocked with 9.2-inch and 7.5-inch artillery shells and the cordite propellant required to fire them. Captain Eric Back was actively hosting a holiday film party on board for officers, civilian guests, and children. The water was perfectly calm, the visibility above the surface was clear, and although the first fear was enemy action, later evidence ruled out an external attack. Without warning, the vessel's own ammunition system became the leading suspect. The Admiralty later concluded that Natal was probably lost when a fire reached one of the aft magazines, and defective or unstable cordite was examined closely in the inquiry. Cordite was a nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin propellant designed to burn rapidly and generate gas inside a gun barrel, not to sit indefinitely in perfect chemical silence. Under poor storage conditions or in defective batches, such propellant could deteriorate and become dangerous. In Natal's case, however, the first spark was never established. The safest reconstruction is not a proven step-by-step chemistry experiment, but a probable cordite-related magazine fire. Once fire reached the aft magazine area, cordite meant to burn inside a gun barrel instead fed a catastrophic internal explosion inside the loaded cruiser. Deep inside the ship, the rapidly expanding gases and blast effects slammed into decks, bulkheads, and shell rooms, ripping the afterstructure apart. The immense internal force sought the path of least resistance, tearing through decks, rupturing compartments, and blowing hull plating outward below the waterline. The catastrophic breach destroyed the vessel's buoyancy as seawater poured into the shattered aft sections, adding asymmetric weight that drove the 13,550-ton warship violently to port. Within about 5 minutes, Natal settled almost bottom up, with her port side buried and her starboard bilge keel exposed. An estimated 390 to 421 sailors, Royal Marines, and civilian guests were killed in the sudden concussive blast and rapid sinking. The suddenness of the event left the Naval Command completely stunned. A heavily armored cruiser had blown itself apart in a harbor considered safe. The visual geometry of the wreckage presented an immediate physical logic puzzle for the salvage engineers dispatched to investigate the site. When heavy-gear dockyard divers entered the freezing waters of the Cromarty Firth in early January 1916, they were confronted with an environment of almost total darkness and severe spatial disorientation. The ambient light from the surface vanished completely beneath the shadow of the massive overturned hull, which rested in water 45 to 54 feet deep. The seabed depth was frustratingly shallow, meaning the upper sections of the inverted hull remained dangerously close to the surface, creating an active collision risk for any deep draft fleet vessels moving through the channel. The divers were tasked with finding exactly what had caused the sinking, a mission that required them to navigate entirely by touch. A heavy gear diver operating in 1916 wore a massive copper helmet, a thick, rubberized canvas suit, and boots capped with heavy lead weights to keep him anchored against the tidal currents. Moving along the bottom of the Firth, the diver expected to encounter the vertical armored walls of the warship. Instead, his heavy canvas gloves met the curved, smooth steel of the vessel's underside, angled sharply back toward the mud. The divers physically mapped the orientation of the wreck, determining that the massive cruiser had not simply rolled over, but had settled at a severe 135-degree list. This extreme angle meant the entire internal layout of the ship was rotated sideways and upside down. The main deck was buried deep in the mud, while the starboard bilge keel confirmed the inverted angle by standing above the harbor surface. The tactile mapping of the hull surface soon yielded the absolute forensic proof of the loss mechanism. The diver slowly crawled aft along the slippery steel, pulling his heavy air hose behind him, counting the internal structural frames by feeling the lines of rivets through the external plating. As he moved past the midship section, the smooth, continuous steel suddenly gave way to a chaotic thicket of jagged, torn metal. He ran his hands along the sharp edges of the rupture. The diver reports placed the worst damage in the aft frame area, with plating blown outward and upward in an irregular pattern. One account described an empty space from frame 172 to frame 186, while another located principal damage around frames 166 to 176. The damage pattern was still decisive. If the ship had been struck from outside by a torpedo or mine, investigators would have expected plating forced inward. The outward bent plating therefore supported the diver's conclusion that the destructive force came from inside the vessel, near or in the after 9.2-inch shell room. The divers continued their slow, methodical survey of the blast zone, uncovering an even more severe structural reality. The blast had also damaged the vessel's primary longitudinal strength. Reports described the ship's back as broken, the sternpost out of line, and a section of keel shattered and depressed. The 13,550-ton cruiser was no longer a sound hull that could be treated as a single recoverable body. This physical evidence answered the question of how the ship was lost, but the presence of a broken 135-degree inverted mass of steel in the middle of a strategic fleet anchorage immediately generated a severe operational crisis. The Naval Command had to figure out how to remove a destroyed armored cruiser from a critical wartime anchorage, a task that directly collided with the immutable laws of heavy salvage engineering. The expectation within the fleet was that the massive cruiser would be swiftly recovered and towed out of the main navigation channel, but the physical reality of the site forced an immediate and complete reversal of standard salvage doctrine. To lift a sunken warship of that immense scale, salvage engineers typically rely on the principles of restored buoyancy. The standard procedure involves sending divers down to patch any holes in the hull, sealing the watertight compartments, and pumping massive volumes of compressed air into the ship. The air pushes the flooded water out, slowly restoring the vessel's natural buoyancy until it lifts itself off the seabed. Alternatively, heavy steel wire cables are tunneled under the ship and attached to massive floating pontoons on the surface, which generate enough vertical lift to raise the mass. But the precise damage mapped during the diver surveys instantly nullified both of these established recovery methods. The structural constraint was severe. Because the blast had broken the ship's back and damaged the keel, the wreck could not be treated as a tight, continuous hull. If salvage crews tried to restore buoyancy in only the more intact portions, the uneven lift could distort the wreck further, open more damage, and make the site harder to manage. The Admiralty's own assessment was stark enough. It was practically impossible to salve the ship or move her any distance, and even removing large articles would be hazardous and of doubtful value. On January 13, 1916, the Admiralty issued a secret operational letter accepting this mechanical reality. The command pressure was intense. Dedicating machinery, manpower, and time to an impracticable salvage effort would disrupt fleet operations. The Admiralty ordered no salvage attempt on Natal and required proper wreck marking lights to be attached to the vessel. Natal was no longer a commissioned fleet asset, but a marked danger. A short-term solution that kept wartime traffic moving while leaving armored steel, non-ferrous metals, and unexploded munitions in shallow water. After the war, that abandoned value shifted responsibility from military engineers clearing a channel to commercial operators trying to extract a profit. Rights and contracts passed through several firms. Stanley, Shipbreaking, and Salvage acquired the wreck but did not begin work. Upner Shipbreaking began operations in the mid-1920s. And Middlesbrough Salvage Company of Stockton-on-Tees was working the wreck by 1930 with the salvage vessel Drudge. Later, South Stockton Shipbuilding and Shipbreaking continued the effort with Disperser. None of these firms tried to raise the cruiser whole. Their practical objective was to reduce the wreck, recover machinery and metal where possible, and sell what the market would pay for. That work required dangerous underwater labor in the Firth. Contemporary accounts confirm diving and blasting operations, but they do not document shaped linear charges or a precise rivet-by-rivet cutting method. Divers and surface crews worked the wreck in heavy, irregular pieces, loosening material underwater and lifting recoverable sections when conditions and equipment allowed. Once a section was loosened, the salvage vessel and its surface gear lowered heavy wire rigging into the turbid water. The divers had to work those cables around jagged, unstable pieces of steel, often with little visibility and with the wreck itself shifting from one operation to the next. The most important mechanical problem came once a recoverable load was ready to move. Once the rigging was secure, the winches above took the strain and lifted whatever the salvors could safely bring out. The physical forces involved in hauling heavy, waterlogged steel through the water column were severe, and as each piece broke the surface, it lost the buoyant support of the surrounding water, sharply increasing the load on the gear. Over time, the commercial crews extracted valuable machinery, metal, and other recoverable material from the wreck. However, commercial extraction was dictated by ownership, contract, weather, equipment, and markets as much as by engineering. The work did not end in one clean commercial decision. Upner's attempt collapsed after the general strike period, Middlesbrough Salvage went bankrupt during the Great Depression, and South Stockton's salvage vessel Disperser was lost with all hands in a storm in 1940. Later surveys showed the result clearly. The wreck had been reduced and scattered, not cleared. By 1970, the maritime geometry of the Cromarty Firth had changed. A depth once tolerated around the wreck now demanded renewed attention as vessel traffic and clearance expectations rose. In 1970, a survey by Metal Recoveries, Orkney, reported a new scale of danger beneath the surface. The wreckage was reported as largely demolished, but the area of the boilers still stood about 40 feet above the seabed, dangerously high for the clearance then being sought. A collision with such rigid, submerged metal could damage a deep draft hull, and the height of the remaining steel was only the first part of the hazard geometry. When the site was assessed, the wreck card recorded the danger that earlier salvors had left in place. The wreck card recorded cordite and projectiles across the site, mixed into the structural hazard. The danger was practical, not abstract. Any attempt to lower heavy wire rigging or mechanical cutting tools into the wreckage risked striking one of the 150 highly unstable artillery shells. The chemical reality of those projectiles made physical extraction impossible. The ammunition hazard was more complicated than a single chemical phrase could capture. Cordite should be treated as propellant associated with cartridges, while the projectiles themselves may have contained separate explosive fillings. The surviving summary records do not identify every round or filler with certainty. Decades underwater could corrode casings, expose contents, and leave ammunition in an unpredictable condition. Corrosion, unknown fillings, and possible sensitive compounds made even minor disturbance dangerous. The ordnance made ordinary cutting and lifting untenable. The site had become a combined structure and ordnance problem, pushing the Ministry of Defense toward naval clearance rather than commercial recovery. In 1971, the objective shifted from salvage recovery to hazard reduction, not final clearance. Royal Navy clearance divers were called in to assess the wreck and make recommendations because the site combined high structural remnants with ammunition spread over a wide area. Explosive clearance was carried out by March 1971, but the desired 40-foot clearance was not achieved, and the site would require further work in later years. The problem had moved beyond ordinary salvage into controlled military clearance. Royal Navy clearance work treated the site as a combined wreck and ordnance hazard. The available summaries indicate assessment, clearance, and explosive work, but they do not provide reliable public detail about exact charge placement or any planned sympathetic detonation sequence. The safer description is that controlled explosive clearance was used to reduce remaining high points and deal with dangerous ammunition where required, under naval control rather than commercial salvage practice. Explosive clearance reduced the hazard. Salvage and clearance entries continued through the 1970s. Work was still in progress in 1974. The wreck was still not cleared of 40 feet in 1975. Royal Navy demolition work resumed in 1978, and another high point was found in 1979. Only after further clearance efforts was the wreck finally declared safe in 1986. It had taken roughly 71 years, from the magazine explosion of 1915 through wartime abandonment, commercial salvage, repeated surveys, and naval clearance to reduce the vertical danger of the massive cruiser. The channel was made safe, leaving the scattered, flattened steel of the armored cruiser entombed in the mud of the anchorage.